Imagine a rule, just one rule, governing the entire world, and it is no matter what the government does to its own people, no one can interfere. Sounds outrageous, isn't it? But for over 300 years, this was not a fringe idea, it was a rule. This is the story of that rule, where it came from, who it protected, who it failed. The story of war and killings that forced the world time and again to ask a very uncomfortable question: what is sovereignty actually for? Let's go back, way back to 1618. A war breaks out in Europe, which lasts for 30 years. Beginning as a religious dispute between Catholic and Protestant princes within the Holy Roman Empire, it quickly escalated into massive continent-wide political power struggle to curb the influence of the Habsburg dynasty. By the time it ended, entire region of Germany have lost a quarter of their population, not just to swords, but to famine and disease. Europe is completely broken, and in 1648, the powers of the continent sit down and sign the peace treaty to end the war. Buried inside that treaty is one idea, deceptively simple, world changing in its consequences. The idea is inside its own border, a ruler answers to no one, not the Pope, not the Emperor, not the king next door. That idea gets a name: sovereignty, supreme, complete authority within one's own borders, and crucially, no outsider could interfere, not even to stop a ruler from harming its own people. Notice what that means. The rule that protects a nation from the foreign invasion is exactly the same rule that protects a ruler when he commits atrocities on his own people in his own country. Let's move fast forward to 1914, World War I. Roughly 17 million people died. For the first time, the world tries something new, the League of Nations, founded in 1920. The first real attempt at collective security, a promise that the world would act together rather than watch alone. But the League has no army, and one country with the power to give it real teeth, the United States, never even joins. So when Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, nothing happens. When Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935, nothing happens again. Then comes a war so much worse that it needs no introduction, World War II. 70 to 85 million dead, the Holocaust. Out of those ashes, the world rise again, the United Nations in 1945. But here is the twist. The old Westphalian idea, the one born in 1648, doesn't disappear. It gets written directly into the UN Charter in the form of two articles which states that all states are equal and the UN cannot interfere in a country's internal affairs. The definition hadn't changed one bit, but it had simply become international law. Still, no matter what was happening inside a country's border, no outsider could step in. Now let's fast forward to 1994 and see what happened inside Rwanda, a country with a Hutu majority and a Tutsi minority, a divide deepened by decades of colonial rule. 6 April 1994, the president, a Hutu, is killed when his plane is shot down. There are allegations that Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Front was behind the crash. Within hours, mind it, within hours, not days, an organized killing campaign begins. The UN force on the ground sees it happening. Its commander warns headquarters. He is refused permission to act. Then 10 peacekeepers are killed, and the Security Council's response: it doesn't send help, it cuts the force. In roughly 100 days, approximately 800,000 people are killed. The rule of 1648 held, no outsider interfered, and 800,000 people paid the price for that rule. A year earlier, on the other side of the world, another story had already begun unraveling. Yugoslavia, 6 republics held together since 1945 under Josip Broz Tito. When Tito dies in 1980, the ethnic tensions he had suppressed start resurfacing. Economic troubles, rising nationalism, and the federation starts to break apart. Slovenia and Croatia declared independence in 1991. Bosnia and Herzegovina follow in 1992. But Bosnia isn't homogeneous, it's a mix. Bosnian Serbs, mostly Orthodox Christians, backed by Serbia, Bosniak Muslims, the largest group who want an independent, multi-ethnic Bosnia, and the Bosnian Croats, backed by part of Croatia. That mix ignites the Bosnian War. Thousands of Bosnian Muslims flee to a town called Srebrenica. In 1993, the UN makes it official Srebrenica is a safe area, protected, guarded by a lightly armed Dutch battalion. In 1995, Bosnian Serbs forces march in. NATO air support is requested, it never arrived. The men and boys are separated from the women, then they are executed. International courts could later rule it what it was, a genocide. Over 8,000 men and boys are killed. Few years later, history repeats itself, but in Kosovo this time. An autonomous province within Serbia, roughly 80 to 90% ethnic Albanian. A decade earlier, Serbia had already stripped away its autonomy. Serbia regarded the territory as historically and religiously central to Serbian identity, as it is the site of the medieval Battle of Kosovo and home to important Serbian Orthodox monasteries. Serbian forces carried out a campaign of ethnic cleansing against ethnic Albanian in Kosovo during 1998 and 1999. Serbian forces now began a campaign to forcibly expel the ethnic Albanian population. Estimates run as high as 1.3 million people displaced. In 1999, NATO does something unprecedented. It bombed Serbia to stop the ethnic cleansing, but without UN approval. A panel of independent experts later hands over a verdict that sounds almost like a paradox: illegal but legitimate. Illegal because it did not have UN approval, and legitimate as it was required. And UN Secretary General Kofi Annan asked the question that this entire story has been building towards. If the world refuses to violate sovereignty, how should it respond when a government commits atrocities that shook all of humanity? That question could not be left unanswered any longer. Canada takes the question seriously enough to act on it. It sets up an independent panel, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, ICISS, and spends a year doing something the great powers rarely do, listening, especially to the global south. They had strict conditions built specifically to prevent misuse, a genuine cause, force only as an absolute last resort, and a real chance of success. And in 2001, they arrived at a new definition of sovereignty, one that would have been unthinkable in 1648. So sovereignty is no longer just a right to be left alone. It is a responsibility a government holds towards its own people. Fail that responsibility and the shield of non-interference lifts. 4 years later, in 2005, all 193 UN members state agree. This new idea gets a name, the responsibility to protect, R2P. Built on 3 pillars. Pillar 1, every state's own duty to protect its people. Pillar 2, the world's duty to help states build that capacity. Pillar 3, a timely, decisive, UN-approved response with military forces only as an absolute last resort. For the first time in over 350 years, the world had officially agreed sovereignty has a condition attached. A new rule always needs a test. Libya provides the first one. In February 2011, a peaceful protest in Benghazi against Colonel Gaddafi's 42-year rule. It is met with violent repression. Anti-Gaddafi rebels formed the National Transitional Council. The word fears a massacre is imminent. This time, the response is different. An arms embargo, a referral to the International Criminal Court, a no-fly zone, authorization for all necessary measures to protect civilians. A coalition, initially the US, UK, and France, begins airstrikes. NATO takes full commands later. By October, Gaddafi is captured near his hometown and killed by a mob. R2P had been used, but it also raised a hard question of its own. Had the word simply used protecting civilian as cover for regime change? That question would hang over the very next case. Because just 1 month after Libya, the same wave of protest that swept the Arab world reaches Syria. A pro-democracy protest against President Bashar al-Assad erupted in Dara in March 2011 and spread nationwide. By July, defected officers formed the Free Syrian Army. Peaceful protest becomes armed insurgency. By 2012, it's a full-scale civil war reaching Damascus and Aleppo. In August 2013, rockets carrying the nerve agent sarin strike opposition-held suburbs of Damascus, a chemical weapon attack, the kind of atrocity R2P was written for. The word did not intervene the way it did in Libya. In 2014, ISIS captured huge swathes of Syria and Iraq, declaring a caliphate. A US-led coalition begins airstrike, but against ISIS, not to protect Syrian civilians from their own government. In 2015, Russia intervenes militarily on the side of Assad regime, tipping the war decisively in his favor. In December 2016, Aleppo falls back under government control, backed by Russia and Iran. The war grinds on for years. It isn't until November and December 2024, 13 years after it began, that opposition forces, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, finally seize Aleppo, then Homs, then Damascus itself. President Bashar al-Assad flees the country. 13 years, hundreds of thousands died, a chemical weapon attack that crossed the world's own red line without triggering the kind of response Libya saw. Libya asked whether R2P could be used too aggressively. Syria asked the opposite question. What happens when the world, divided by its own power politics, simply fails to use it at all? Let's move to the one last and a recent story. Interestingly, in the story, almost everyone claims someone else is the one violating sovereignty. It starts in 1979 when a hostage crisis triggers the first US sanctions, a trade embargo that only grows from there. By the 2000, it's gone multilateral. Between 2006 and 2010, 4 United Nations Security Council resolutions target Iran's nuclear program. In 2012, the EU bans Iranian oil outright, and the US squeezes Iran's central bank. Then in 2015, a rare moment of de-escalation, the JCPOA is signed. Most sanctions are suspended in exchange of verified limits on Iran's nuclear program. It doesn't last. In 2018, the US withdraws from the deal and reimposes sanctions under a policy called maximum pressure. In 2022, after the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody and the brutal crackdown on protests that followed, sanctions expand again. And then, in a span of weeks, in late 2025, the whole architecture snaps back into place. The UN, the EU, and the UK simultaneously restoring the full weight of sanctions that had been eased a decade earlier. Iran responded by violently suppressing consequent protest, nuclear inspections. Approximately 30,000 to 40,000 people died. By February 2026, this is no longer just an economic story. Strikes ignite open war. So who is violating whose sovereignty here? A UN expert has criticized the sanctions themselves for worsening a humanitarian crisis inside Iran. Gulf officials call Iranian military actions and the Iran's assertion of control over the Strait of Hormuz a gross violation of their sovereignty. And the Iran's own government points to decades of crackdowns on protest and dissent as evidence that the state has failed the very people R2P was designed to protect. There is no clean villain in this version of the story. Sovereignty is being invoked by every single side to justify sanctions, to justify military strikes, to justify crushing dissent, and to justify resisting outside pressure. It is the entire history of this idea compressed into one unresolved ongoing case. So if sovereignty cannot be broken, then who decides when and who get punished? Two very different court sits in The Hague. The International Court of Justice, founded in 1945, judges states, never individuals. In 1986, it ruled the United States violated international law in Nicaragua. Today, it is hearing South Africa's case against Israel over Gaza. The International Criminal Court, created in 1998, does the opposite. It prosecutes individuals, never states. Its very first conviction in 2012 was a warlord who conscripted child soldiers in the Congo. Its most recent warrants named Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Yoav Gallant. Four different guardians of sovereignty, a political body that can override sovereignty but only if the veto allows it. A court for states with no enforcement power of its own. A court for individuals with no army to arrest anyone, and a framework, R2P, that redefined the entire idea but still needs the Security Council's permission to act. Every single one of them depends in the end on the willingness of powerful states to say yes. So let's retrace the story. A definition of sovereignty born in 1648 as an absolute shield. A blind spot in that shield, one that let government harm their own people without consequences. Massacres and wars, Rwanda, Srebrenica, Kosovo, Syria, that forced the world over and over to admit the shield had a cost. And a new definition, sovereignty, not just as a right, but as a responsibility. Tested in Libya, failed in Syria, fought over from every possible direction in Iran. And here is what has not changed. Every mechanism we have built to enforce that responsibility, the Security Council, the ICJ, the ICC, R2P itself, still runs through the same room, a room where most powerful states hold the final vote. So I'll leave you with the same question the story has been circling from the very beginning. Will the world ever build a definition of sovereignty that outlives the politics of powerful? Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more such interesting videos in the area of international relations.